Star Wars is one of the largest franchises anywhere in the entire world that spans across films, TV shows, books, and video games. And although the video games that have come out in more recent times have been hit or miss, back about 2 decades ago, they were at their peak. George Lucas himself saw the immense potential that video games had to expand his story and universe, and so he started his own video game company, LucasArts. By the late 90s and early 2000s, LucasArts was at its peak. No longer just making about one Star Wars game per console that lined up with a movie story, they began to branch out and tell stories besides the ones that had already been told in the films. They began working with a bunch of other companies to create unique games, the result of which was some of the most memorable games in the Star Wars franchise. This was truly the Star Wars video game renaissance. Ask anyone around my age if they have any fond memories of video games like Battlefront 2 or KOTOR. Maybe they played something a little different like Rogue Squadron or Episode 1 Racer. All of these great games left an impact on my generation the same way that games like Halo or even San Andreas did. In 2006, what was probably the very peak of the Star Wars video game renaissance, as a celebration of all the great games that had already come out, LucasArts released Star Wars: The Best of the PC. Not all the great games that came out during this time were included in this 5-game compilation, but I don't think anyone would complain about the 5 that did make the cut. I decided, since I own an original copy from back in the day, and it's still in its karmically large plastic jewel case, that I should review these 5 games. Because, well, why not? If I view the games in the order in which they're displayed on the back of the box, I'll have to start with Star Wars: Empire at War, and this is a good place to start, as it is the game that I played the most out of this set of 5. That's probably because it's the one that has the most mod support and a decent sized community, even today. It's not really surprising, basically this is the only Star Wars game of its kind. There weren't many other Star Wars real-time strategy games made, and this is the most recent one, despite coming out in 2006. Developed by Petroglyph Games, famous for their amazing mobile game, Coin a Phrase, Empire at War was a rather standard RTS of the time, with a world, or galactic overview, simple building system, and rather basic maps. The real interesting gameplay innovation comes from the 2 different fields of battle, space and ground. Before you get to all that, you'll have to go to the main menu, where you'll find a tutorial front and center. Definitely give this a run if you're new to RTS, but more experienced RTS players should be able to figure it out with some time. It's not all that complicated a game. Then you'll find a single player, multiplayer options, a load game button if you have a save, and most of the other stuff that you'd expect from a main menu. It's in the single player menu where you'll find most of the actual game. The campaign is a little bit confusing because there are technically 2, one in which you play as the Empire and one in which you play as the Rebellion. They have different missions and different objectives, but they both take place leading up to the Battle of Yavin. With the Rebels, you work on implementing the X-Wing, the discovery of the Death Star, the Emperor follows Darth Vader hunting down the Rebels, and the construction of the Death Star, both acting kinda like a pre-Disney Rogue One. They are short, simple, and don't really even seem to be the real meat of the game. Nevertheless, it's more than satisfactory, and it will give you some unique gameplay objectives that you can't get in other game mode. Galactic Conquest is the RTX sandbox campaign that most people are probably used to. You're given a number of scenarios which alter the number of planets on the map and the number of planets and resources that you start with, and you can change some of these options if you're not okay with the defaults. Finally, there are skirmish battles, which serve as a simple custom battle. You capture resources and provide currency for upgrades and units as your enemy tries to do the same, and you both try to destroy one another's bases. In terms of gameplay, Empire at War is pretty simple. You move your units to the enemy planet, destroy the space defenses in a space battle that automatically engages, and then you use your ground units to invade the planet and destroy the ground forces. You can't actually capture a planet until you destroy its ground defenses. So even if you successfully destroy the space defenses of a planet and just leave your fleet in orbit, the enemy will continuously send fleets to try to stop you, as seen here. I destroyed the space defenses for this planet, but I just couldn't beat the ground defenses due to some BS, so I just left my fleet there, and they were constantly harassed to the point where I could no longer even hold the space around the planet. If you're looking for some interesting government or economic system often found in RTS games, it's best to look elsewhere. Empire at War works pretty simply. You gain money for capturing planets, and you gain money as time goes on, as the game happens in real time. You can increase the output of planets through things like mines or trade routes with other planets you own. But otherwise, that's about it. On planets, you have 3 slots for fleets that can be filled up with a large number of units, both space and ground. Ground units are carried in space transports for free, although if the enemy fleet attacks your space transports, they're basically defenseless. On the ground, there's a lot fewer spaces, which can be a little bit frustrating when it comes to defense, but it is doable. There are also building spaces which allow you to have barracks, which will spawn extra troops during defense. You could also build a bunch of mines, which produce more currency, or set up factories to build vehicles, etc. The decisions are really up to you, as you would expect from any decent RTS game. The ground battles have a much smaller unit size and capacity when compared to space combat. So it's not like you'll find a Total War style game, it's much more similar to something like StarCraft. This tends to be a problem since you have low limits on ground and defense. You really need to build things like the aforementioned barracks in order to actually have enough troops to, defend the planet. Although, that's nothing compared to the amount of ground units you'll need to successfully invade a planet. The major restriction that makes invasion so difficult is the small number of units you can spawn via the landing zones. And obviously these landing zones are the only places that you can actually spawn units in, making it an easy choke point for units to be constantly murdered by the defenders. I mean, look at this BS. My spawn point is completely surrounded and I genuinely can't spawn in units fast enough to defeat the enemies that are there. There is a slight upside to this, as most maps will have more than one landing zone, and if you capture them, it will increase your population cap. This also means you can spawn in units at different locations. This is an alright mechanic, but I think the population cap for invasion is already really low, which makes it difficult to capture the second landing zone, if there is one at all. Defenses are somewhat confusing. When I'm attacking an enemy planet, it seems that they have way more troops than that planet should allow, but when I'm defended, I'm limited to like 10 units. Depending on the planet, the population might fight alongside you in the defense, and if you're invading, you can commit many war crimes, like destroying their homes in order to cause them to lose the will to fight. Come on man, I'm the rebels, I'm trying to free from tyrannical empire. That being said, I think that most of the people who play this game would recognize the ground battles as really the weaker of the two. The space battles are where the real fun is. For example, there are interesting encounters that happen between ships, just because both faction ships aren't carbon copies of one another. They have their own unique ships and their own unique playstyles. The same happens on the ground too, but the two have fewer differences, mostly in vehicles. The infantry units differ slightly, but not significantly, and it really doesn't make it feel like you're playing a completely different faction. It more so just feels like a new skin. I will say that playing Rebels seems to be slightly harder than playing Empire. That might just be because I'm bad. With Empire you get bigger ships at lower tech levels, so it's much easier for a bad player, or not so high level player, to just buy a bunch of those and power through everything. With the Rebels, there's a little more strategy, based on your need to have more direct control of the forces that you are using, on both ground and space. That brings me to the factions. There are two and a half-ish, at least in the base game. Obviously the Rebellion and the Empire, which I've already mentioned, and the Half faction, which are the Space Pirates. The Pirates aren't a faction you can really control, but an AI faction. They exist on planets that aren't already occupied by the Rebels or the Empire at the start of the games. This reminds me of something. In space battles, I think the Empire and the Rebel units match the Star Wars art style, or at least the original trilogy, pretty well. But of course, it features a lot of vehicles from the films themselves, so that's kinda to be expected. On the ground battles, I find a lot of the units look out of place, especially the Rebels. I mean, look at this tank. It looks like something from 40K, not Star Wars. As I mentioned before, the Empire is pretty simple. You have a bunch of big ships with big guns that are really slow, so you basically brute force everything. Your fighters aren't as effective as the Rebels, but they're cheap and can be produced in large numbers with ease. Thus, you can create a giant swarm of them and use them like bees. On top of that, larger Imperial cruisers have built-in hangars, which allow them to deploy bombers, scouts, and fighters throughout the game. By the late game, you don't even have to build separate fighter squadrons anymore. These capital ships produce enough fighters to cover the fleet, and enough bombers to destroy enemy ships. As I mentioned before, the Rebellion is slightly more complex to play, but if you learn to play them right, they can be pretty powerful. They're mostly focused on their fighters and bombers. Of course, the balance of Empire at War is about everything having a counter. For example, the Nebulon B may seem to be the Rebel version of the Acclimator class. They cost about the same, are available at the same tech level, but they differ. The Nebulon B is tougher, faster, and designed to brawl, while the Acclimator is weaker but carries fighters and bombers. Nevertheless, both of these serve as a general purpose ship for both sides, just designed to work within the faction's design, which is the way that makes having different factions like this so unique. If you make them have the same units, it doesn't make sense. The Rebels are fast, they hit hard, but they have to get out quickly, where the Empire is all about just massing huge, slow fleets and steamrolling the entirety of the enemy. Speaking of unique units, heroes are a unit that I've neglected to mention up until now. They're quite simple. They're specialized units that are often purposely overpowered. This is fair because you can only have one of each hero at a time, and they often feature some special ability unique to them. Aside from that, there isn't much else to say about them. I think Empire at War is a really fun game to play. Not just because is it a good RTS, but I think it's best said this way. It's super simple, but enjoyable. It's not something that you want to sit down and waste your time doing. It's something that you can sit down and relax doing. And in a time when everyone's playing a game to their max, trying to be as good as they possibly can be, it's nice to play a game that's just fun, that you don't have to worry about maximizing, optimizing everything about. You could play Empire at War like that, but it doesn't feel like it was the way it was meant to be played. And I think that's a good thing. It's a fun game. It's a good game. There's not really much else to say about it. That sums up most of the game for me. Many of the things that annoyed me about it were really just a result of its age. And I don't know if I can really dock it for that. It's an incredibly fun game, even now, and that's what really matters. 7 out of 10. Check it out if you're interested.